Hello, welcome to our second part video over the 60s. So if you haven't watched part one, I encourage you to watch that. Um, this video is basically going to go over the civil rights movement that's happening in the 60s. So huge part of American history, right? Because it finally gave African Americans federal laws to protect them and ensure that they have equal rights under the law, which is a huge thing. And also, this is part of your potential essay question, talking about what's happening in the civil rights movement, right? The steps that occurred during this movement in the 60s. Also, this lecture would be very helpful when you write your SLO essay, talking about why the year 1968 is the turning point of American history, largely because the civil rights movement has to deal a lot with that, right? Where American society is changing, right? We're being desegregated. We're allowing equal rights for all Americans, despite race. So these things are very important. I encourage you to listen closely and take notes over this lecture. Um, all right, so the civil rights movement in the 60s made a lot of gains. Many civil rights activists pushing for school desegregation in the 1950s were mainly middle class and middle aged. But in the 60s, you have a new movement of civil rights, a sort of rebirth of it, which was mainly a younger generation, college students, sort of stepping up and trying to make a difference, trying to achieve civil rights. So this younger group, they acted in many marches, right? They had many marches. They had many protests, demonstrations, and this all helped push the civil rights movement forward because the key strategy of this was instead of violent protests, they decided to do peaceful protests. So peaceful protests, this was a huge thing. It's always easy to have a violent protest, right? It's always easy to riot and revolt and stuff, but it's harder to turn the other cheek, and try to be better, um, be better than the people who are persecuting you. And that's what the many of these members of the civil rights movement in the 60s did. They turned the other cheek. They were peaceful, and they did new tactics in order to achieve their goals. So one of the key strategies of this nonviolent protest was civil disobedience, right? And doing things that you're not really supposed to, but not in a violent way, right? Like sitting in a white section instead of a colored section of a grocery store or a restaurant or even a bus, and that was a huge strategy at this time. So uh, a big thing that was happening was the strategy called sitting in. And this first happened in Greensboro, North Carolina, where a bunch of students and protesters sat down in a segregated lunch corner, right? Corner that was meant for only whites. So they sat there and refused to leave until they were served, right? And news coverage of this protest showed up across the whole United States, right? This became a huge sensation, and it inspired a lot of future sit-in demonstrations around the South, and also it inspired the free ride movement. So the following year, civil rights activists attempted to have a broader variation of sitting in, right? So they participated in what's known as free rides, which was uh, where basically they would go onto buses and trains and stuff, and many colored people would sit in white sections, right? Think about I'm sure you've heard of Rosa Parks before, how she refused to give up her seat, and ended up getting arrested because she sat in the wrong seat on her bus. Actually, in the 80s, when my parents were in school, Rosa Parks came to their school and talked about her experiences during the civil rights movement. So I guess she went like on tour around the country to tell Americans about her experiences, which I thought was pretty cool. That this was actually a public figure who went around trying to spread the message of civil rights and stuff. So freedom rides was a huge movement at this time. Tons of protesters took part in this, and it was largely successful. Public transportation was eventually desegregated, showing that peaceful protests were they were possible, that and they could be successful, and it's inspired many business boycotts, sit-ins, and peaceful marches, which really was the highlight of this 60s civil rights movement. And a big organization at this time that was formed was in April and May of 1960, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, was formed, and they organized this, what's known as the Birmingham Campaign, which was a huge part of the civil rights movement. So, in the Birmingham Campaign, Birmingham, Alabama, was one of the most segregated areas of the country, and it was filled with hatred. So what the SCLC, led by Martin Luther King, decided to do was to have peaceful protests in Birmingham. They decided to do business boycotts, sit-ins, and peaceful marches while in Birmingham. Um, and during this time, Martin Luther King himself was put in jail, um, prompting his famous handwritten letter from the Birmingham jail, urging not only a nonviolent approach to civil rights, but an active confrontation directly to violence. Just basically saying, hey, even if they're violent to you, be peaceful, continue to push on because this stuff really matters. And this made Martin Luther King even more popular, right? Writing from prison, still even after getting arrested, still preaching a message of peace. Now I'm sure you've heard Martin Luther King before. Uh, he was a Georgia native, actually, so grew up in Georgia. I think I've driven by his house before. Um, it was like a museum or whatever. So he got his PhD and became a priest, not a priest, a preacher, right? Um, so he was a very educated man, and he sort of looked towards um, the sort of peaceful protest leader of a few decades earlier, Mahatma Gandhi in India. So Gandhi, he practiced this, like Martin Luther King, this peaceful campaign to sort of let India gain its independence from England. And this happened in like the 40s and 50s and stuff, and it was largely successful. They of course went through a lot of struggles to gain India's independence, but eventually they gained their independence from Great Britain, right? So Martin Luther King looked over to Gandhi and was like, "Hey, this guy has some pretty good ideas," and applied it to his sort of nonviolent protest during the civil rights movement. So while all this stuff was happening in Birmingham, there was all sorts of news footage of African American protesters getting beat up and getting dogs sicked on them by white police officers, right? There were also footage of like fire hoses, right, being sprayed onto protesters who were not violent. They were just peacefully marching, right? And these are men, women, children getting beat up and abused by white police officers, you know? So this was a huge, it's really showed through the news footage that that segregation in the South was real, and that was violent, right? And should America, given at this time, remember what we talked about with decolonization, how they're preaching to these new countries that are forming in Africa, like, hey, America has such a free country. We have all these freedoms and rights and stuff. While on the news, African Americans are getting beat up in the streets, right? So it made the U.S. seem very hypocritical, and it gave a lot of people a change of heart. So, but there were still many people at this time who decided to continue to enforce segregation. And one of those men was George Wallace, who was elected as Alabama's governor in 1963. We'll get to that slide in a second. But George Wallace became Alabama's governor, and in his inauguration speech, he proclaimed segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. So he was a very deeply racist man who was the governor of Alabama, and he did everything in his power. He really became a symbol of preserving segregation in the South. But at the same time, these protests by the SCLC and Martin Luther King continued. The Birmingham campaign was eventually successful, right? And inspired, and later in the summer of 1963, in August of 1963, the famous March on Washington. So March on Washington officially started on August 28th of 1963. Almost 200,000 blacks and whites gathered in Washington to call for, among other things, civil rights legislation, social integration, and end to discrimination in the public and private by public and private employers. Also, they called for job training for the unemployed and to raise the minimum wage. So general civil rights for all Americans, that you would think in America, right, preaching this is the land of the free and the brave, that we would have these rights on the books already, that these rights were given and guaranteed. But at this point in time, it wasn't, and that's what these people fought for. Also during this March on Washington, Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. I'm sure you've heard that before, where he called for civil rights for all citizens across the United States and into persecution, segregation, and racism, to fulfill this promise of all men are created equal. Right. So that's what Martin Luther King proclaimed. And this inspired the president at the time, John F. Kennedy, to support a civil rights bill. So he tried to get his civil rights bill pushed through Congress, but it was shut down largely because the southern states, the southern politicians who were largely white and promoted segregation in the first place, didn't want that system to come to an end. So Kennedy's civil rights bill was eventually stalled in Congress. Then on November 22nd, 1963, JFK was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, Texas. Right. So the United States youngest president ever, was assassinated. He was at this point he was really beloved by everyone. He was like a rock star, and internationally famous. And he was in his open motorcade when Lee Harvey Oswald shot him. Actually, there's this really interesting show on Hulu called 11/22/63. So the date that JFK was assassinated. So 11/22/63 is this Hulu show where James Franco, the actor, he's playing this guy who goes back in time to sort of stop the assassination of JFK to save the world or something, which is a very silly premise. But it's a pretty interesting show. And I encourage you, if you have Hulu, to watch it because it's a pretty good show. Um, and uh, and it shows a lot of the things like segregation that's happening at this time, racism, but also gender roles. So sort of those things are happening all in the 60s. So I mean, if you're going to be at home during this time of isolation and stuff, you might as well just watch a good show, right? So anyway, JFK, he was assassinated. He was shot in the head. His wife, the video is very sad. His wife's trying to like pick up the pieces or whatever. Even though he was shot in the head, he still lived on for a few hours. But eventually, he passed away. So JFK ended up dying, and the vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, became the next president of the United States. So Johnson, he really didn't want the presidency at the be. He didn't set out to be the president. He was the vice president. He was this older Texas politician. He was a Democrat, but he believed in fighting poverty and inequality, and he sort of brought that to the presidency. So he pushed. Johnson actually ended up pushing the civil rights movement even further in the United States, which was a huge thing. So Johnson became the next president, and even though Johnson was older and he didn't have that sort of younger enthusiasm that JFK brought to the office. He got things done. So he was actually able to convince Congress to pass the Civil Rights Bill, um, and eventually get passed in Congress. Um, so in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was eventually passed, right? So this is widely considered to be the most important piece of civil rights legislation in American history. This comprehensive act barred segregation in public accommodations, outlawed discrimination based on race, ethnicity, and gender, based on national or religious origin, right? So this guaranteed a federal law saying that every American citizen has equal rights, or civil rights. Uh, so the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, but it didn't automatically fix all the race problems that happened in the South. Many cities continue to be segregated even after this. And for example, in the South, many African Americans were still disenfranchised, right? They were still turned away from voting. And voting is just one of the basic rights that we were supposed to have in America, right? So for example, in March of 1965, activists attempted to march on Selma is from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, on behalf of local African Americans achieving voting rights. So these protesters um, they marched from Selma to Birmingham. But again, on the news, you see all these violent reactions to this, right? Police officers beating up protesters, dogs being sicked on them, fire hoses being sprayed on the people marching. Um, so the march from so there were tons of videos like this being shown internationally, right, on the news of these peaceful protesters just wanting voting rights, right, even after the Civil Rights Act was passed. Um, and this inspired the Johnson to pass the Voting Rights Act bill of 1965, which abolished voting discrimination in federal, state, and local elections. Um, so this was huge that African Americans in this 2-year period gained civil rights and they gained voting rights, right? So this period in American history is very essential, and it shows a core turning point in American history, right? Going back to one of those topics of the SLO essay that you're supposed to write about. So Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act, two very important pieces of legislation that guaranteed rights uh, that was enforced by the federal government, right? Um, so so President Johnson, and really the first few years of his presidency, he got a lot done. Like I said, Johnson grew up in Central Texas, and he grew up during the Depression, right? And he saw all the positive impacts that the New Deal had on the poor across the country. So when Johnson became president, he started wanting to revamp this New Deal. Also, during the early 60s, the United States was going through one of the largest economic downturns that occurred since the Great Depression, right? So Johnson saw his presidency as an opportunity not only to ensure civil rights for all Americans, but also to sort of recreate a great society, to create this great society, which goals were included the elimination of poverty and racial injustice, and he created tons of new programs to sort of ensure this. So, as part of his plan for a great society, Johnson passed the Economic Opportunity Act, so the EOA, in 1964. This was to help lift the disenfranchised and impoverished from poverty. So tons of programs to sort of help the poor get out of poverty by training them, providing federally assisted trainings to help them get jobs. Um, so one of Johnson's biggest programs that he pushed in his presidency as part of this great society was this war on poverty, which was very much like the New Deal programs that he grew up with. Um, so so the war on poverty did help tons of Americans get out of poverty at this time, but obviously didn't end poverty. But this shows that the presidency is getting even stronger, and the presidency is assuming this larger social role of protector of the people, by assuring rights and helping people economically, right? So this is a huge turn in the presidency during Johnson's campaign. So while Johnson was in office, he passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and he tried to establish this great society in America through this war on poverty and many programs, to try to help people lift people out of poverty and disenfranchisement. So in the 60s, things are changing fast in the United States, right? Segregation ended federally, legally, and this was the beginning of a major transitional moment for our country. And that's the whole purpose of um, why 1968 is the turning point of American history, right? This is civil rights definitely has something to add to that. So that could be something that you write about in this SLO essay. All right, so on Wednesday, I will post a couple more videos over to YouTube, which will talk about what else is happening in the 60s, right? We'll talk about Vietnam again. We'll also talk about the hippies, right? Hippies and women's rights, and those things are all happening during this major transitional moment in American history that we know of as the 60s. All right, so if you need anything, I encourage you to check Blackboard frequently, like I said before. Also, check your syllabus for due dates on these major assignments coming up and further instructions on that. If you have any questions, I encourage you to contact me, right? Email me through my West Georgia Tech email, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can with that. All right, so I hope you have a good day, and stay safe.